We're on this series that we've been doing for the last couple of weeks, and we'll do for a good few more yet, on Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, this collection of teachings Jesus gives about how to live life God's way. Last week, if you were here or you caught up online, Ruth looked at Jesus' teaching on murder and anger. Tricky subjects that Jesus covers. And this week's no different because we're on the subject of adultery and divorce today. All right, so nice cheery start to our week, if ever there was one. And so we'll have a look and see what Jesus has to say about this. This is from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5, verses 27 to 32.
You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery.
Now we'll come on to the content of what Jesus says there. I do like the way Jesus is portrayed there, though. Someone who clearly, he just clocks people. He understands the human mind and desires. He's someone who's unafraid to tackle sensitive subjects, and that means that we as a church, I think, are obliged to tackle sensitive subjects as well, because Jesus doesn't shy away from them himself. And he sets a high bar here, I think, saying that although one of the 10 commandments is do not commit adultery, for Jesus, even looking at someone lustfully is the same as actually doing anything about it. Why? Well, because lusting after someone, it reduces their humanity to simply being about sex, of being a sex object, which is a pretty demeaning way, I think, to describe anyone as an object. Yes, being noticed by others, that can make us feel good about ourselves. And we might even think, well, chance to be a fine thing a bit these days, perhaps, to be noticed in the way we've maybe used to be. But there's a big difference between attraction and lust. Because lust treats someone as less than fully human. And as Jesus shows time and time again, whether because of status or wealth or gender or sex, he's dead against anyone being treated as less than human because it doesn't honor the image of God in which each of us are made. And so how does he recommend we overcome this lust, this objectifying of others? Well, he makes his point by exaggeration. He says, if your right eye causes you a sin, cut it out. Not literally, perhaps, but in other words, stop looking at people in that way. Stop allowing your thoughts to run away with you. Stop reducing people to something less than they are. And I guess this is where self-control, one of the fruit of the Spirit that we looked at last year, comes in. It's this process of asking God to help us have self-control, to form good habits, to not indulge certain thoughts or ways of seeing people. And I think it's in this context of not wanting people to be treated as less than fully human, which maybe helps us to make sense of what follows, which is Jesus' teaching on divorce. There's other passages in the Bible and other places where Jesus talks about this, but he says a few words here about it. So let's break down a little bit of what he says. So he begins, he says, "It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce." And here he's quoting the book of Deuteronomy in the Old Testament, which reflected, even up to Jesus' day, the common practice in Bible times that if a wife displeased her husband, he could simply issue a certificate to her and divorce her. Now, what was reckoned to be grounds for being displeased? Well, it could be anything. Could be anything from not finding her as pretty as another woman to her burning his dinner. Yeah. Sounds ridiculous in some ways, and there's sort of old sayings about people burning toast and getting divorced and so on, but that was the power and the status that men generally had over women in Jesus' day, which is pretty ropey, to say the least. Now, of course, that made women incredibly vulnerable, since at a moment's notice they could be left homeless and without any income, because women weren't generally able to earn a living for themselves. So being divorced, often on no more than a husband's whim, well, that was a dangerous, even life-threatening situation for a woman to be in. Here, though, Jesus says, yeah, but I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now, what do we make of that? Well, it seems to me, in other words, that Jesus is saying if a wife has an affair, well, that can be legit grounds for divorce. But if a husband simply decides to divorce his wife because she's displeased him, well, not only is he forcing her to try and remarry because she couldn't survive in that society on her own, but in doing so, he is effectively forcing her to commit adultery. And so it's a very one-sided way of looking at divorce, treating women appallingly, robbing them of honor and integrity and reducing them to an object that could simply be discarded. No wonder, I think, therefore, Jesus comes out so strongly against divorce in this case, because it was being used to treat women as less than equal, as less than human, something which we continually see Jesus passionately fighting against. Indeed, that's why I'd suggest we can take Jesus' demand for equality and a shared understanding of humanity as shedding helpful light on how we might understand the rightful place of divorce today. You see, we can look elsewhere in the Bible for what other grounds there may be for divorce, as alongside unfaithfulness on either part, we see abuse, abandonment, or perhaps most broadly, neglect as being legit reasons as to why it may be right to end a marriage. We can define neglect as failing to help or enable someone else to thrive. And so why is neglect important? Well, where there's emotional, practical, maybe financial, physical, or spiritual neglect in a relationship, it suggests that either one or both parties aren't treating the other with the honor that they deserve. They're not recognizing the full humanity in the other. And so where this neglect is ongoing and it can't be worked through or addressed, then I'd suggest we can see neglect as being legitimate grounds for divorce. And if divorce is permissible, even sometimes preferable, then it follows that remarriage can also be a good and righteous thing. Of course, none of this means that we take divorce at all lightly. I don't think any of us would say that. After all, vows have been made with the best of intentions before God and as part of a community. But the Jesus we see in the Gospels, the Jesus we see who was passionate about people knowing life in all its fullness, well, I'd suggest he'd be veering far more these days on the side of compassionate understanding than a hardline insistence on people remaining married at all costs. Above all, as we see, I think, from his teaching here on what we might call unbridled lust and one-sided divorce, Jesus came to champion the inherent worth and integrity of all people. And that's a way of understanding, that's a way of living that I'd suggest we'd all do well to follow.